Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this afternoon. So the project that I wanted to introduce today is called Window Dressing, and it takes the form of a facade installation along the Washington Street face of the Commons that revisits the site's recent history and reflects on the building's changing role within downtown Columbus. And so before I begin, I just want to start by providing a brief overview to some of the interests behind my research and practice that has informed this project. So a lot of my previous work occupies the space between architecture, public art, and experimental preservation to think about some of the maintenance practices and material afterlives behind architectural production. And often this unfolds through site-specific installations that intervene within existing buildings and spaces, or projects that work with inherited materials and material processes. And so a number of the projects that you see here grew out of an interest in tracing the cultural histories and environmental footprints of familiar building materials, such as terracotta tiles or foam insulation, and to reflect on how our perception of these materials might be reframed through new tools, media, or aesthetic registers. Within the context of Exhibit Columbus, I've been very excited to think about how this way of working could provide a framework for engaging some of the material histories that are embedded in the Commons site. When I first approached the Commons, it struck me that one of the most fascinating aspects of the site was its temporal dimension, and the fact that it is not only defined by the current building that we see today, but also the traces of many other structures that came before it. And so I began my research by looking back at the cycles of construction and demolition that have taken place on this site throughout the past century, focusing in particular on the original 1973 Commons and Courthouse Center by Cesare Pelli and Norma Merrick-Sklarick for Gruen Associates. What intrigued me about this building was the fact that it was demolished in 2008, just 36 years after it was completed, and replaced with the Kadokim building that we see on the site today. And I found this somewhat surprising that in a city like Columbus, that is renowned for its progressive attitude towards post-war preservation, this building had a relatively short lifespan. And so I wanted to dig a little deeper into this brief episode and the site's timeline, and to look at the Commons within a longer lineage of late modern mirrored glass buildings from the late 60s and 70s, many of which were defined by their seamless and highly reflective glass envelopes. I'm interested in looking at the cultural and material histories that shape these buildings, as well as how the public perception around them has shifted in the last 50 years to a point where today many of them are on the verge of switching categories from what we might think of as unfashionable to historic. And so I began by looking into the origins of mirrored glass as an architectural surface through a product called ReflectoView that was being developed at Sarin and Associates in the late 1960s for use on the Bell Labs facade in Holmdel, New Jersey. The process of fabricating this material involved vacuum coating glass with aluminum to produce a silvery reflective surface, and the technique drew inspiration from other innovations that were taking place within the aerospace industry at the time, such as the use of metallized mylar film on projects like NASA's early Echo balloon satellites that you can see on the image on the left here. Like mylar, mirrored glass was branded for its ability to reflect its surroundings, as we can see in many photographs of buildings from this period by the photographer Wang Tom, where the superimposition of clouds on a gridded surface became the iconic image of late modernism. In addition to its aesthetic appeal, mirrored glass was also often marketed as performance glass, or as an energy-saving device that would block out solar gain and reduce air conditioning costs. While this often failed on a practical level, where these buildings became so dark inside that the need for increased lighting often ended up driving up electricity bills, the material nevertheless presented an image of performance that reflected the energy anxieties of the 1970s, where ideas of environmental control were reduced down to a single paper-thin surface. And so returning back to the Commons, I was interested in tracing the kind of spatial imaginations that mirrored glass enabled, specifically the idea of a climate-controlled, air-conditioned public interior, that was maintained by the city, inhabitable throughout the seasons, and that was able to house a wide range of civic functions. And so, with the help of Tricia Gilson from the Columbus, Indiana Architectural Archives, I came across these incredible photographs that give you a sense of the kind of events and activities that took place inside the Commons, from fashion shows to prom nights to Christmas concerts, all of which present a vibrant and chaotic image of the building as an adaptable social space. The original intent behind the building's design was that these events would be visible from the sidewalk, facilitating a direct connection between this public interior and the street beyond. But the one-way characteristic of mirrored glass meant that while it was very easy to see out, it was almost impossible to see in. And so you end up with these conflicting images of the building from this period that are difficult to reconcile between exterior and interior, surface and its effects. And in many ways, ultimately, the building's inability to engage its immediate urban context became one of the driving arguments behind its eventual demolition. Today, this brief episode in the site's history is almost completely erased, but we continue to grapple with some of the questions that the project raised around the performative potential of building envelopes, not only as a means to separate inside from outside, but as a highly charged surface that is able to reflect architecture's inner lives and desires. And so for me, this raises the question, what relevance does this building hold for our current moment during the pandemic when so much of our experience of public spaces relies on the act of looking in from the outside? And in many ways, the architectural facade holds a kind of renewed agency. And is there a way to set up a project that recalls elements of this history, but also provides a medium for speculating on what the future face of the Commons might look like? And so building on this set of loose questions, the project that I've been developing is called Window Dressing, and as its title suggests, it takes the form of a temporary facade installed along the Washington Street face of the Commons that reinterprets the mirrored glass history of the site through a new material. The material that I've been working with is Mylar film, which for me presents a lightweight and low-tech counterpart to mirrored glass that grew out of the same period, when material innovations in the aerospace industry were adopted for a wide range of commercial applications. Just by looking at a selection of Mylar's many uses, from DIY forms of solar control like window films and windshield reflectors, to much more frivolous applications like party balloons and tinsel that speaks to an architecture of events and celebrations, we're immediately presented with an expanded set of definitions for how we might think about a performative surface that opens up a number of design possibilities. And so the design for this temporary facade builds on the idea of window dressing as the layering of surface treatments and effects to think about how we might dress up the hermetic surface of the curtain wall facade that currently occupies the site by disrupting it and trying to tease out some of its inner contradictions. For example, if we were to abandon the pursuit of smoothness and thinness, how might we thicken the facade in both literal and metaphorical terms? In place of the stable engineered surface, would it be possible to imagine a facade that allows for multiple readings and experiences? Applied to the Commons facade, this reimagined second skin takes the form of a series of reflective Mylar shingles that are layered together in varying densities to form a kind of architectural tapestry that would respond to air movement, pedestrian traffic, and other rhythms that unfold along the sidewalk. On the right here is a video of a full-scale mock-up of a small section of this facade that gives you a sense of how the material might move in the wind and register changing lighting conditions and reflections. Some of the details of this temporary surface also draws from other forms of architectural cladding, like rain screen systems and asphalt roofing panels, which are reinterpreted here as a series of lightweight adhesive panels that could accommodate different shapes and patterns, but also be easily removed at the end of the exhibition period. In the current scheme, the installation occupies one section of the Commons facade located between the two entrances. The height of the facade opens up a range of possibilities for how the piece might be experienced from different vantage points, and so the scale and resolution of the image changes as you move up the elevation to accommodate different viewing distances. For example, when you're standing right next to it, your attention would be focused on the human scale details along the base of the facade, where the mylar shingles are closely set and layered, providing a textured and tactile surface. This render provides a rough illustration of the project as a static image, but in reality, as the individual panels would be fluttering in the wind in a similar way to the video that we just saw, the kind of reflections that you might see would also be constantly changing. As you back away or view the piece from across the street, the facade scales up and flattens out, and the reflections of the sky and the neighboring buildings become the most dominant aspects of the piece. At this scale, the piece also provides an opportunity to incorporate other graphic references, perhaps ones that point back to the iconic photographs of mirrored glass buildings that we saw earlier, where the subtle movement of clouds is a recurring theme. Here's another view of the project to give you a sense of how the piece would appear from an angle as you're approaching it along Washington Street, where some of the textural variations would become more prominent. And finally, I want to end with this image of the project in context in order to consider how this temporary facade could give rise to programmatic possibilities that would normally take place inside the commons that could potentially spill out onto the sidewalk, from outdoor performances to more impromptu gatherings. As I move forward with this project, I would love to think more about how the installation could serve as a backdrop to the social life of the building, perhaps by looking back to some of the photographs of the commons interior that we saw earlier, and thinking about how we might recapture the spirit of that moment as an outward-facing gesture on the building's facade.